Born into a powerful royal bloodline cursed by inbreeding, Margaret Theresa was doomed from the start. Shipped off to marry her own uncle at just 15, she became Holy Roman Empress, only to waste away in a life of sickness, depression, and endless pregnancies. Join me as we explore her story. Infanta Margarita Teresa, or Margaret Theresa in English, was born in the Royal Alcazar Palace in Madrid on the 12th of July 1651. Her father was King Philip IV. He had been the ruler of Spain since 1621, after ascending to the throne when he was just 15 years old. Philip was known as Rey Planeta, which means the Planet King. This was because Spain's empire stretched around the world by then, covering most of Central and South America, the larger islands of the Caribbean, the Philippines and Asia, and some small parts of the coast of Western Africa. Margaret's mother was Mariana or Maria Anna of Austria, a daughter of Ferdinand III, Duke of Austria, and Holy Roman Emperor. Both of her parents were born into the mighty House of Habsburg, a dynasty that rose from the rugged borderlands of Switzerland and Austria in medieval times. As the years passed, the Habsburgs began to conquer much of Europe, but not primarily through bloody wars, no. Well, they had mastered the art of marriage as power, forging alliances that allowed them to seize vast empires. By the late 15th century, they inherited the Spanish throne, becoming Europe's most unstoppable force, a family whose power knew no limits. The Habsburgs weren't just known for their vast empire, they were infamous for their dangerous obsession with inbreeding. Generation after generation, they married within their own bloodline, sealing alliances at the cost of their own health. This twisted tradition would lead to devastating genetic consequences, crippling their dynasty from within. Margaret Theresa's parents weren't just distant relatives, they were far closer than anyone should be. Her father was from the Spanish branch of the family, her mother from the Austrian side, but their connection ran much deeper, because, in a shocking display of royal inbreeding, they were uncle and niece. The disturbingly close blood ties between Margaret's parents came at a cost. Of their 5 children, 3 died in infancy. Only 2 survived, Margaret and her younger brother Carlos, known as Charles in English. But survival didn't mean salvation. Charles was a walking testament to the horrors of inbreeding. By his 20s, he was prematurely aged, balding, and plagued by a grotesquely deformed jaw. His mind seemed to wither just as fast as his body, showing signs of early dementia. He was later nicknamed by contemporaries the Bewitched, as many believed his physical and intellectual issues were the result of sorcery. In fact, Margaret and Charles's inbreeding coefficient was grotesquely high, with some estimates suggesting they were as inbred as children born to siblings. To this day, historians debate whether Charles's condition was purely genetic, the tragic result of centuries of unchecked inbreeding, or something else. Margaret may have been luckier, but she wasn't completely unaffected. Though much healthier than her brother, she carried the Habsburg curse in her own way, as we will see. Margaret was raised in the grandeur of the Royal Alcazar Palace, a world of opulence where every whim was catered to by an army of maids and servants. For example, the Infanta frequently indulged in sweets and chocolates, which she had to hide from the court physicians. Yet, beneath the luxury lay the suffocating constraints of the Madrid court, where every movement, every word, every glance was dictated by unyielding royal etiquette. As a princess of the mighty Habsburg dynasty, she received the finest education money and power could provide. She was taught multiple languages, versing herself in German to better converse with her Habsburg cousins from the Austrian side of the family, and learned some Latin, the sacred language of scholarship and the Roman Catholic Church. But no education could prepare her for the fate that awaited her. As Margaret grew older, She couldn't ignore the glaring age gap between her parents. Well, her father was nearly 30 years older than her mother. But if that detail disturbed her, she never showed it. Age differences aside, her parents adored her. She was their prized jewel, the only truly healthy child their union had produced, and they showered her with affection. With her delicate features and lively spirit, Margaret captivated those around her. She was their little angel, a nickname whispered with adoration by family and friends alike. Perhaps that's why her parents commissioned one of Europe's greatest painters to immortalize her in a stunning portrait when she was just 5 years old. A portrait that would become one of the most famous paintings in history. Velázquez's painting was once known as La Familia, the family. Today it is called Las Meninas, which means the ladies in waiting. This is a more appropriate title as it depicts Margaret being waited on by several household staff who are fixing her dress. Among the many figures captured in the painting, another stands out, Marie Barbola, a courtier with dwarfism. In an era when those with her condition were often reduced to mere entertainment for the nobility, Velázquez did something radical. Instead of simply portraying her as a joke, he gave her depth, dignity, and a piercing gaze that suggests a complex inner world. Even Velázquez himself appears in the masterpiece, a silent observer of the lavish yet rigid world of the Spanish court. Other people are seen in paintings and mirrors in Las Meninas, including Margaret's parents. And this wasn't the only famous painting of Margaret either. Velázquez painted no less than 5 portraits of the princess in her youth, immortalizing her prettiness and royal elegance. In fact, she was one of the most painted young people in all of early modern Europe, crafting her image of power and prestige, though this would contrast with the sad destiny that awaited her. It might seem hard to fathom to modern minds, but by the time Las Meninas was painted in 1656, when Margaret was just 5 years old, there was already a growing discussion at the Spanish court about who she would marry. In the ruthless world of royal politics, marriage was never about love, it was about power. Emotions and personal desires meant nothing when dynasties were at stake. As the daughter of the King of Spain, Margaret wasn't just a princess, she was a high-stakes chess piece in the brutal game of European diplomacy, her future decided long before she even understood it. For instance, at one point there was a suggestion that she could marry Charles Stuart of the English royal family. He was restored to the English throne as King Charles II of England, Scotland and Ireland in 1660, after England had briefly experimented with being a republic in the 1650s. A marriage of this kind would have been used to form an unlikely alliance with the English, at a time when France and Spain were bitter rivals for dominance of Western Europe. In the end, Charles instead married Catherine of Braganza, a Portuguese bride in 1662. The collapse of negotiations for Margaret to marry Charles Stuart was primarily owing to King Philip's opposition. Instead, he believed that his daughter should marry a member of the Austrian side of the Habsburg family. He seemed to show no concern whatsoever that this marriage would deepen the family's inbreeding. After all, it was simply how the Habsburgs kept power in their grip. As for Margaret, she had no say in her fate. When negotiations between Madrid and Vienna began, she was likely blissfully unaware of the shocking consequences this union would bring. She was still just 11 years old when it was announced at the royal court that she would marry Leopold of the House of Habsburg. Like her mother before her, Margaret was now destined to continue the incestuous Habsburg tradition and was going to marry a very close family member, a man who was both her first cousin and her uncle. Leopold was her mother's younger brother, and had succeeded to become Archduke of Austria, King of Hungary, Croatia and Bohemia, and the Holy Roman Emperor in quick succession in the late 1650s. Even in early modern Europe, there were some standards around when a child was old enough to marry. Margaret was betrothed to her uncle early in 1663, but she was deemed to be too young for the marriage to take place at that time. Instead, it was not until April 1666, by which time she was nearing her 15th birthday, that Margaret set off from Madrid to travel to Vienna. A 6-month tour followed, and the Spanish royal party only arrived in Vienna in December 1666. The marriage ceremony took place a few days later, on the 12th of December. It was a magnificent event, attended by many of Europe's most powerful royals and dignitaries, with no expense spared. And the grandeur didn't end there. Celebrations raged on throughout 1667. Yet, behind the splendour, a dark fate was already unfolding. Life in Vienna was peculiar and sometimes difficult for Margaret. To begin with, she and her new husband had a strange marriage. It might surprise modern ears to hear this, but they didn't try to ignore their close blood relationship. She actually called him uncle. Despite this unorthodox situation, they did get along. They enjoyed some of the same pursuits, including art and music, and Leopold did his best to make sure Margaret was comfortable in her new surroundings. It was also common for royals like Margaret, when they left their homeland to go and marry a foreign ruler or prince, to bring along members of their old household staff. So she would have had some familiar faces around her at the court in Vienna, as she acclimatized to her new life. Perhaps there were even some of the people who had been there in Madrid when Velázquez was painting Las Meninas many years earlier. Despite this, Margaret remained deeply homesick, clinging to her Spanish roots and doing little to improve her German. As time passed, her once delicate beauty began to fade, her complexion grew paler, her features more fatigued, and the characteristic Habsburg jaw became more pronounced. The marriage was troubled in other ways too. Margaret became pregnant almost immediately after arriving in Vienna, and gave birth to a boy named Ferdinand in September 1667. He only survived for 3.5 months though, and died in January 1668. Their luck seemed to change with the birth of their next child, a daughter, Maria Antonia, born in January 1669. She would be the only one of Margaret's children to survive. 2 others were not so fortunate. A son, John Leopold, was born on the 20th of February 1670, but tragically died within hours. Another daughter, Maria Anna, lived just 2 weeks before passing away in February 1672. And this devastating pattern was a sign of things to come. Margaret's difficult series of pregnancies were partly owing to her own health problems. Although she had been a much healthier child than her brother, she did have some growing health issues in the years leading up to and following her arrival in Vienna. When she arrived to the Austrian capital late in 1666, people there quickly began commenting on her frequent illnesses. For a time, many observers put this down to the constant strain of pregnancy. In just 6 years, she endured 6 pregnancies, including 4 live births and 2 miscarriages, each leaving her weaker and more depressed than before. But as time passed, it became clear that something more sinister was at play. Margaret was often confined to her bed, even when she wasn't pregnant. Physicians diagnosed her with an enlarged thyroid gland, but in the 17th century, there was no cure, and her condition only worsened. Things really went downhill for Margaret in the early spring of 1673. She had a 3-week-long attack of stomach pains. Then she developed a fever. There are documents that were written by foreign ambassadors at the court at Vienna at this time which indicate that many were seriously concerned that she would die. By early March, she had difficulties breathing, and on the 10th of March a confessor was called in to hear her last confession and give her the sacrament. Just 2 days later, on March 12th, Margaret died at the tender age of 21. An autopsy revealed a heartbreaking truth. She was carrying another baby boy at the time of her death. Her life, cut tragically short, ended in the imperial crypt in Vienna, where she was laid to rest. The death of the Archduchess and Holy Roman Empress resulted in a lengthy mourning period at the Austrian court. The funeral services stretched on for weeks into April. Leopold was devastated by his wife's untimely death. However, this didn't stop him marrying again by the end of the year. His new wife was Archduchess Claudia Felicitas of Austria, a member of the Tyrolese branch of the Habsburgs. But for Leopold, the marriage wasn't about love, it was about survival. The dynastic game had to continue, and more heirs were desperately needed, preferably male, to ensure the Habsburgs' reign could endure. After Margaret's death, her rights to the Spanish throne were passed to her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia. When Maria Antonia herself died in 1692, her rights were inherited by her only surviving son, Prince Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria. However, Joseph Ferdinand's untimely death in 1699, coupled with King Charles II's failure to produce an heir, would trigger a succession crisis that plunged Spain and all of Europe into a brutal war that lasted nearly 15 years. A crisis that perhaps could have been avoided if the Habsburgs hadn't destroyed themselves from within due to their incestuous practices. Thank you so much everyone for watching this video on Margaret Theresa of Spain. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of the video down below in the comments, and if you have any more suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. Anyway, I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next Forgotten Life. Thanks.